I woke up because someone was crying my name so softly that, for one terrifying second, I thought I was dreaming. When I opened my eyes, the woman from the apartment next door was lying beside me, her face wet with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched my sleeve. She wasn't awake. She wasn't even aware she was there. And the only words that escaped her lips were, "Don't leave me alone." I had no idea that those 5 words would uncover a tragedy hidden for 23 years, destroy everything I believed about the people around me, and give 2 broken strangers one final chance to save each other. Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. Until that night, my life had been painfully ordinary. My name is Nolan Mercer, and after my divorce 3 years earlier, I had settled into a quiet routine in a small apartment building outside Portland. I repaired antique furniture during the day, spent evenings reading on my balcony, and had convinced myself that loneliness was easier than risking another broken heart. My neighbors mostly kept to themselves, except for the woman who lived across the hall. Her name was Eliza Rowan. She always smiled politely, carried groceries for elderly residents without being asked, and watered the flowers outside the building even though no one had assigned her the job. She looked peaceful on the outside, but every now and then I noticed shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. Sometimes I heard muffled footsteps in the hallway before sunrise, as if someone wandered aimlessly while the rest of the building slept. People whispered that she sleepwalked. Others claimed she talked in her sleep. One elderly tenant insisted she had once found Eliza standing barefoot in the parking lot during a thunderstorm with no memory of how she got there. I dismissed the stories as neighborhood gossip until that impossible midnight changed everything. After making sure she was safe, I gently woke her. The instant her eyes opened, confusion swept across her face. She looked around my bedroom, realized where she was, and turned completely pale. She apologized over and over, horrified, unable to explain how she had entered my unlocked apartment. I expected embarrassment, but what frightened me most was the terror in her expression when I mentioned what she had whispered. She insisted she remembered nothing and hurried back across the hall before dawn, leaving me with questions that refused to disappear. The next morning she avoided me completely. Her curtains stayed closed. The flowers outside remained dry for the first time since spring. By afternoon I knocked on her door just to make sure she was all right. After several moments she opened it only a few inches. Her eyes were swollen from crying, yet she forced a smile that fooled absolutely no one. She thanked me for helping her and admitted her sleepwalking had become worse recently because of stress, but she refused to explain further. Before closing the door, she quietly asked if I could pretend the whole incident never happened. I wanted to respect her privacy. Instead, concern slowly replaced curiosity. Over the following weeks I noticed little things that didn't make sense. Fresh bruises appeared on her wrists. She flinched whenever her phone rang. She sometimes stared at the playground across the street with tears gathering in her eyes. Once I saw her freeze completely when a little girl laughed, as though the sound had unlocked a painful memory. One bright Saturday morning I found her sitting alone on a park bench watching families enjoy the sunshine. She looked exhausted. Without asking questions, I simply sat beside her. We spent nearly an hour speaking about ordinary things like coffee, weather, favorite books, and childhood pets. Eventually silence settled between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like 2 lonely people quietly admitting they needed another human being nearby. Over the next several months our friendship grew naturally. We visited farmers markets, helped each other with apartment repairs, and shared dinners after work. I learned she designed children's books from home. She learned I still blamed myself for my failed marriage because I had buried myself in work while my wife silently struggled with depression. Neither of us pretended to have perfect lives. Somehow our brokenness made honesty easier. Still, every few weeks another sleepwalking episode happened. Sometimes she wandered into the hallway. Once I found her sitting on the building stairs hugging her knees while asleep. Every single episode ended with the same heartbreaking whisper begging someone not to leave her alone. Eventually I convinced her to visit a sleep specialist. She resisted at first, terrified of what doctors might uncover, but finally agreed. The specialist suggested that severe emotional trauma sometimes resurfaced through parasomnias like sleepwalking, especially when painful memories had never been fully processed. Hearing those words visibly shook her. She admitted there were parts of her childhood she couldn't remember clearly. Entire years felt blurred, as though someone had erased pieces of her past. That conversation became the first crack in a wall she had spent decades building. A week later everything changed. I returned home during lunch after forgetting important paperwork. As I climbed the stairs, I heard shouting from inside Eliza's apartment. A middle-aged man stormed out carrying a folder. He glared at me with cold, calculating eyes before disappearing into the parking lot. Moments later I found Eliza collapsed on the kitchen floor, shaking uncontrollably. Between broken breaths she revealed that the man was her uncle, the relative who had raised her after her parents supposedly died in a car accident. He had arrived demanding that she stop asking questions about her childhood because digging into old records would only hurt everyone involved. Until then I hadn't even known she had been searching for answers. She finally confessed that after every sleepwalking episode she woke with fragments of disturbing images. A little blue bedroom. A woman's lullaby. A locked basement door. Someone screaming. None of it made sense. She believed they were nightmares until they started repeating with impossible consistency. Together we visited the county records office. We expected dead ends. Instead we discovered that several documents connected to her parents' accident had been sealed. A retired police officer agreed to speak privately after recognizing her name. His voice trembled as he admitted he had always believed the investigation ended too quickly because influential people wanted it buried. According to him, there had never been convincing evidence that her parents died in an accident. They had disappeared. The official story had protected someone. That revelation shattered Eliza completely. Every certainty she had ever known collapsed within minutes. The uncle she trusted suddenly became the center of impossible questions. Why lie about her parents? Why erase records? Why discourage her memories? For days she barely spoke. Then another sleepwalking episode came. This time she wandered into my apartment carrying an old music box I had never seen before. While asleep she opened it. A faded melody echoed through the room. Tears streamed down her sleeping face as she whispered not only, "Don't leave me alone," but also another sentence she had never spoken before. "They locked Mommy downstairs." The words froze my blood. The next morning she had no memory of saying them, but the music box changed everything. Hidden beneath its velvet lining was an old photograph. A smiling young woman held little Eliza in her arms beside a man standing outside a farmhouse. The farmhouse still existed. 2 days later we drove there. The building stood abandoned beneath towering trees. Broken windows stared back like empty eyes. Most people would have turned around. Instead, guided by instincts neither of us understood, Eliza walked directly toward the back entrance. Inside, dust covered everything. Then she stopped. Without hesitation she walked through the hallway and stood before a weathered basement door. She began shaking violently. "I know this place," she whispered. The local sheriff later searched the property after we reported suspicious evidence. Hidden beneath loose floorboards investigators discovered personal belongings belonging to Eliza's parents, along with journals that had somehow survived decades untouched. The truth was devastating. Her parents had uncovered financial crimes involving several relatives, including the uncle who later adopted her. Before they could expose everything, they vanished. Authorities never recovered them. Fear, corruption, and missing evidence buried the investigation. Eliza, only 5 years old at the time, had witnessed enough to traumatize her mind into locking away the memories completely. The uncle had spent years convincing everyone, including her, that her parents died in an accident. Her sleepwalking wasn't random. Her subconscious had spent 23 years trying to lead her back to the truth. When investigators confronted her uncle with the newly recovered evidence, the carefully constructed lies finally unraveled. Criminal charges followed. The community that had admired him watched in disbelief as decades of deception surfaced piece by piece. People congratulated Eliza for finding answers. They had no idea those answers nearly destroyed her. Knowing the truth didn't erase the pain. It multiplied it. She mourned parents she had already grieved once as a child. She questioned every memory, every birthday, every holiday, every comforting lie she had accepted. She stopped eating. She barely slept. She blamed herself for surviving when they never came home. Watching someone you care about disappear emotionally is a different kind of heartbreak. There were mornings when I simply sat beside her in silence because words had become useless. Healing refused to follow a straight line. One afternoon she confessed something that nearly broke me. She admitted she had always believed something inside her was broken because people kept leaving. Friends drifted away. Relationships failed. Even during sleep her greatest fear wasn't monsters or darkness. It was abandonment. That single sentence she whispered every night had never really been meant for me. It belonged to the frightened 5-year-old child still trapped inside her memories. For the first time, I understood why that midnight had happened. She hadn't wandered into my apartment looking for romance. She had wandered toward safety. Months passed. Therapy slowly replaced nightmares with understanding. Her sleepwalking became less frequent. She smiled more often. She returned to illustrating children's books, but now her stories centered on courage instead of fear. One of her books featured a little fox who believed everyone would leave until he discovered that real family sometimes chooses you instead of being born with you. Meanwhile, I discovered healing of my own. Caring for someone else forced me to confront wounds I had ignored since my divorce. I stopped punishing myself for mistakes that couldn't be changed. I learned that love isn't measured by dramatic speeches but by ordinary mornings, patient listening, and staying when life becomes unbearably difficult. Exactly 1 year after that impossible midnight, we stood together in a quiet memorial garden where plaques honored victims whose stories had finally been uncovered. Eliza placed fresh white lilies beneath her parents' names. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they carried peace instead of despair. She squeezed my hand and smiled through the emotion, telling me she finally understood why her sleeping mind kept repeating those words for so many years. She hadn't been asking one specific person to stay. She had been begging life itself not to abandon the frightened child inside her. I quietly promised that child she would never have to face the darkness alone again. A few months later, surrounded by close friends and neighbors who had become our chosen family, we celebrated not only justice finally arriving after decades but also the beginning of an entirely new chapter neither of us believed possible. The building where we first met planted a small community garden in honor of resilience. Children laughed between rows of flowers while elderly neighbors shared stories on sunny afternoons. Watching that ordinary scene somehow felt more miraculous than anything else. Sometimes miracles aren't loud. Sometimes they're simply two wounded people choosing not to run away. Speech balloon special request: before the story ends, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in this situation? If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more meaningful and inspiring stories. Your support encourages us to keep creating stories that touch hearts around the world. Life has a strange way of leading broken hearts toward healing through unexpected people and impossible moments. The greatest act of love is not rescuing someone from every storm but staying beside them while they learn they are strong enough to survive it. Kindness can awaken forgotten hope, forgiveness can free hearts chained by the past, and second chances often arrive disguised as the very moments that first terrified us. Never underestimate the power of simply being there for someone who believes the whole world has already walked away, because sometimes those quiet words, "I'm not leaving," become the beginning of an entirely new life.